Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at oh, cool. Okay. We fix it all on study. There are a few of them like that for this reaction rates for the face. But we see the evolution of those non-achievements. You know, they all have to try to find it, but everything I know you said is I say it's working. I got really yes, okay. Gives not because these and that's not serious assumption. But I know this the last thing there. How's it structured that above she yeah. Yeah, no, but it's right because we're in this yeah, no, I was worried that this is why I feel they just read oh, God, like that's true. I didn't know but we'll get some. I'm gonna say hi. He's married. Yes, that's it. Yeah. Hi, how are you? So we met we met in Madison many years ago, and we were reporters together back in the day. So great to see you. Welcome. Yeah, good to see you. I'm so glad you guys are doing this. So thanks for being here. Looking forward to it. Thank you. Congrats on the book. So when you were in comments on there, afterwards, by or something. Yeah, I was there. Or talking to you and questioning what you were doing. I did not. I've been outside a long yeah, yeah, how do you think I'm going back to I didn't expect that. Well, you take this is written how many okay, it's really good. This was one of the two close to me. What you got? China system. Yeah, yeah. Great. But they put on a very nice ability more. Surprising. You know, it's really nice, really good. Something that's very nice, but you can't tell you where it was. I guess when you I love it. I think the album kind of must be yeah, I can speak Chinese since I were like they're like okay, I guess you're for real. I'm surprised you think that, not that it would be the way they were out of the ground.
Yeah. It's very simple.
Yeah. Pro-business.
Yeah.
Checking real quick, but we want to help run these questions.
That's not right. That's what about it.
Yeah.
I mean, if the older generation, people will go out of frame.
Okay, we're close enough to virtual time, you can go ahead and get started. It's great to see all of you coming present tonight. My name is Susan Hyde. I'm the co-director of the Institute of International Studies. A very brief role of introducing our speakers. Our guest of honor for the Elberg Lecture is Howard French. As many of you know, Howard French is an award-winning author and journalist whose work spans decades of reporting on Africa, Asia, and the African diaspora. As a former correspondent for the New York Times, he is the author of several acclaimed books, including Global Blackness, which reframes the age of exploration to the centrality of Africa, and China's Second Continent, an investigation into Chinese migration across Africa. He is a professor at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, where he continues to shape the next generation of global reporters. And my department chair, Scott Strauss, came in and said, he's the best journalist on Africa that I know. So I think that's high praise coming from Scott Strauss as well. Adam Hochschild is a celebrated author and journalist best known for illuminating forgotten or overlooked chapters of history with moral clarity and narrative power. His landmark book, King Leopold's Ghost, exposed the brutal colonial exploitation of the Congo Free State and helped revive international awareness of one of history's great atrocities. He is also the author of Bury the Chains, Spain in Our Hearts, and American Midnight, among others, and is co-founder of Mother Jones magazine. He's a longtime Bay Area resident, which is part of why we're lucky to have him here today, and has taught at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. We're here, of course, in the occasion is the release of Howard French's new book, and Adam is going to be in conversation with Howard about this topic. So with that, I'll leave it to the guests of honor, and please join me in welcoming them.
Well, thank you. We're going to try it without microphones, but if you have trouble in the back hearing us, wave your arms or something and we'll pick up the mics here. I want to begin with something you said that Howard is the most respected journalist about Africa today. And I want to begin with a question that'll take us to your book eventually, but about something else. In your last book, Global Blackness, you in part critique what historians have missed about Africa over the years. What do you think journalists are missing about Africa today?
That could be our entire conversation. You know, I don't want to be too specific in my answer because I've done it in personalized this or even speak in specific institutions, but if I can speak about a kind of blog, you know, Western journalism, I think that let me just tick off a few things quickly that they've missed. You know, the old story dating back as long as there's been modern Western journalism in Africa is they're only interested in a set list of topics of famine, of coups, of corruption, of so-called big men, and you know, the things that speak of a kind of perceived dark side of the quote unquote dark continent. And that's still with us, right? That tradition still endures. The flip side of that coin is Western journalism, by and large, and there are certainly exceptions, but by and large doesn't cover Africa in the way it covers other continents, meaning looking at the whole range of human life. Looking at, by its fixation on the things I just mentioned, it is missing the fact that Africa has incredible cultures, that Africa has incredible entrepreneurialism, if that's what you want to look at, that African politics are not just about big men, they're complicated and messy and deep. And so, you know, the two sides of this coin combine to mean that you're getting this gloss all the time over the continent. And it's very hard to see a way out of that. So deeply are they embedded in this way of engaging on the topic of Africa. I was delighted, I'm going to break my own rule, I said I would cite individuals or institutions, but I was delighted very briefly the other day, maybe a week or 10 days ago, the New York Times had a profile of the man who is reputed to be Africa's richest person. And it's a Nigerian character named Dangote. I thought, wow, look at this. The New York Times is, and I could see it just for a glance that before I started reading it, that it was a big package. The New York Times doing a big piece about somebody in Africa who's not a dictator or, you know, and then I proceeded to read the piece, and the piece was a gloss in a whole other way. So it's a long uphill climb out of this pit, and I'm sorry to be so pessimistic to begin with. I didn't think we'd begin there, but that's what I'll say.
Well, let's switch to a more optimistic moment for Africa. The subject of this book, where, as you explain at the beginning of the Second Emancipation, this is not a biography of Kwame Nkrumah, the independence leader and first leader of Ghana, but it's sort of a meditation on his role, his dream of Pan-Africanism during the decade that he was in power. Tell us why you decided to focus on him and on that particularly pregnant moment in African history when so many countries were becoming independent.
Sure, it's like so many of the answers I think I'll end up trying to give you. It's a complicated story. I finished the previous book, Global Blackness, in 1945. And I had originally had the notions of doing a follow-up book, picking up after 1945. And I didn't immediately know what shape that would take, but that was a notion with me from an early time. And my editor at Live Right, who I get along with very well, a guy named Bob Weil, said to me, you know, I've been dying to have a book about Kwame Nkrumah for the longest time. I don't know why he was dying to have a book. It wasn't immediately apparent to me, but he was passionate. I really want a book about, and he started out in a clever, coy kind of way. Can you suggest somebody to write a book about? And I took him, at face value, and so I started giving him names of people who I regard highly and who I think could do a nice job on this topic. And he never followed up on any of them. And after about a year of this, he said to me, Howard, don't you get it? I really want you to write a book. So to make this as short as possible, I spent a great deal of my life in Africa in general, and especially in West Africa. And I have a very deep connection to Ghana and to Ivory Coast, which is in a complicated way. I actually,
Because your family was living there
yes,
when you were a student.
my family moved there when I was in college. And after college, my family moved back, and I went thinking I would spend a year in Ivory Coast, and I ended up spending 6 years there and becoming a journalist and getting married, having a child, et cetera, et cetera. So that explains, my particular connection to that sub-region of West Africa. And I was going to say, Ivory Coast and Ghana, were it not for the Europeans, would probably have been one country, right? What they share is far more deeper and more abundant than what divides them at a sort of sub-political. And so, I've been traveling to Ghana, and I'm more and more aware of my age as the days pass here, but I first traveled to Ghana in 1975, which is, it occurs to me, bad though I am in math, half a century ago. And I thought, Bob Weil, my editor, said, a book about Kwame Nkrumah. I thought, two things. One of them, I think I know the story of Kwame Nkrumah pretty well already. And also, who wants to know about Kwame Nkrumah other than my editor? Right? It was not immediately evident to me. So I eventually said, I'll sort of scratch around, I'll do some due diligence. And so I began to read and to think about this more seriously. And this began to turn up all sorts of things that I understood poorly or didn't know at all. So that's the proximate genesis of this book. I mean, one of the stories had a sort of layman's understanding Pan-Africanism as a topic. And as I began to research this and trying to figure out where did Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism come from, I began to discover just immense realms of new information and knowledge that I found passionately interesting. So that's partly why this isn't just a straight biography of Kwame Nkrumah. It's trying to do a lot of other things. It's talking about the sort of deep history of Pan-Africanism as a dream, as an ideal that actually, dates to, this to my surprise, dates to the earliest parts of the 19th century at least, and has roots all around the Atlantic Rim. There were Pan-Africanists writing very intelligently in Africa, in Europe, in North America, and in South America, dating back a very long time. And I only had the slimmest understanding of that prior to beginning to do this. So the book tells a lot of that story. The book also, another sort of realm of discovery for me really was, and maybe I'm anticipating something we'll want to talk about later, but I thought I knew a lot about the African-American connection to Ghana, which is deep and rich in its own terms. But I didn't really fully understand how important Ghana had been to the American Civil Rights Movement. And it had been truly important. So that was
Ghana became independent in 1957,
right,
which was just when things were starting to heat up here.
but it had been struggling for independence since the early 50s. And it wasn't just the independence that illuminated the imaginations of American civil rights activists, it's the struggle. And the struggle was very particular. Kwame Nkrumah won his first election at a time when the British did not expect him to win, and were not really thinking about imminent independence. He won the first election, which began to make this inevitable, from jail. As somebody who was espousing nonviolence and who was behaving in a nonviolent way and who had read Gandhi and who had thought very seriously about all of this. It turns out, would prove to be deeply influential on Martin Luther King and on the American Civil Rights Movement in other ways. And so this also goes back to the journalism question you asked me in the beginning. I guess one of the signal failings of the blog toward Africa is we have been conditioned, not just the journalists, we as Westerners, that's a problematic term, but I'm just going to use it for this. We as Westerners, we've been conditioned to imagine or to believe or just to take for granted that Africa is not really important in very many ways. And Africa is not very connected to anything important. And everything I was discovering in the early research phase before I committed to writing the book was telling me that this is not true. Africans have been connected, modern African, Born in Blackness is about connections going back to the early in the second millennium, right? Africans have been connected in these modern ways, deeply and richly and importantly. And so I said, okay, I'm convinced I'll do the book. It's not going to be a straight biography, as you said, but I'll try to pull on these other strings and to try to draw this out.
Is it, and Pan-Africanism, as voiced by Nkrumah and the people around him, was very much a thing in the 1960s and the early 70s. Is it time to take a fresh look at that dream of African unity, given the fact of the European Union? I've sometimes, I remember one occasion, an African friend pointed, we were in a customs line somewhere, and he pointed very enviously to somebody ahead of us who had the European Union passport, because if you're in the EU, you have an EU passport, and then lower down it says what country you're in, and what country you're from. And he said, I wish we had something like that for Africa. Now, Europe, admittedly, it took quite a few centuries and a couple of world wars before they got to that point. Do you think that Africa could get there sooner?
I think, first of all, I think the reason, I'm not an expert on Europe, but my sense is that one of the reasons Europe finally made its way toward union was not just the economic benefits that this promised, but also relief from domination, which it also promised, right? It has never fully delivered, as we can see today. But that seemed to be one of the offerings of coming together in union. And I think that this is an important offering, that unity of some kind that stands as a possible future for Africa offers to Africans. And I also would say that although it's true that Western expressions of Pan-Africanism, Pan-Africanist sentiment probably peaked somewhere between 1957 and the end of the 60s. At the popular level in Africa, Pan-Africanism has never faded. Africans still believe in Pan-Africanism. Africans still think very highly of the notion, and even, I would say, of the necessity for us to get, I'm voicing as if I was speaking on behalf of Africans. I want you to understand I am not trying to do that, but so in my own clumsy way, I'm voicing it in African voice. We see the need to do this, even if our useless governments don't. We think that the only way forward for us is to get rid of the little cookie cutter states that we have been bequeathed as a result of European imperialism, and to build bigger formations. And for these reasons, Africans revere Kwame Nkrumah. It turns out that Kwame Nkrumah, it remains the most popular figure in modern African history around the continent. It's not Nelson Mandela, as most Americans or Westerners might imagine. To turn to your passport thing, Africans experience the world in many humiliating ways. And one of them is, being treated. Trump is just the latest expression of this, right? There's travel humiliation was a feature of African life long before Trump rolled around, right? That you get shunted to a different side of the immigration line or even of the visa interview line and treated with great suspicion, held to higher standards, because we, meaning now I'm voicing as if I were the American consular agent, we think that if we give you poor Africans visas, you're just going to take advantage of Americans' wealth and, violate the terms of your visit or your stay, right? Africans dearly want to throw off that cloak, right? And this is just one of the many reasons why I think the notion of Pan-Africanism remains alive in the African popular imagination, that if we build larger formations and make them more prosperous and viable and therefore stronger, it will be more difficult for people to treat us that way.
Paint a picture for us of Nkrumah and the remarkable array of people that he knew during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I was really struck by this reading the book. He knew W.E. Du Bois, he knew Lumumba, Ralph Bunche, George Padmore, the West Indian independent, Kenyatta. How did he encounter all these people? Where did he encounter them? What was the flavor of their conversations?
This was one of the most remarkable things of this. One of the most remarkable pieces of discovery for me in researching the book. In some sense, what I'm going to say to you is a banal feature of human life. All of our lives are shaped and marked by coincidence, by accident. You happen to be one place one day as opposed to another place one day. It's remarkable when you stop to think of it, how many things downstream that may change, right? Even having said that, Nkrumah's life is, in this regard, is just the most incredible story. So Nkrumah's born in 1909 in the far southwestern corner of Ghana, really a neglected area of a colony that had been very lucrative for Britain, but into which Britain plowed almost no resources. In other words, Britain created no schools, Britain created almost no roads, Britain did almost nothing for the Gold Coast except extract from gold, from cocoa, from timber, etc. Right? So Nkrumah's from the most neglected and remote part of this colony. And he's, moreover, the only child of what I usually call a junior wife. In the polygamous setting, his father had several wives, and the mother of Nkrumah was down the totem pole in terms of the order of wives, right? And therefore didn't really stand to have much of a claim on the meager resources of the father under ordinary circumstances. He was not the father's first son, although it's the only child of the mother. And she, by dint of whatever force, personal will, she convinced him to send the father to spend what the little bit of marginal income that they could afford among all of their children to send Kwame Nkrumah to school. The British had created no schools. And so school meant a one-room schoolhouse in the far southwestern corner of the country, of the colony, run by a Catholic priest. And so that's the first thing. It's the coincidence of, just having the mother who had that force of will, right? Nkrumah shows up, he didn't have to want to tell the funny story I tell in the book. She had to park herself outside of the school for the first week or so because he would try to run away every day. Anyway, he turns out to be an extraordinary student from a very young age, and he makes a deep impression on the priest. Next coincidence, a couple of years later, the colonial government of Gold Coast changes. Gold Coast is not, even though it's lucrative for Britain, politically speaking, the British didn't imagine anything about to happen in Gold Coast. So governors had a great amount of leeway, personally. And so the coincidence here, by British colonial terms, a very progressive governor is named to Gold Coast. And this guy says, hey, wait, we have no schools here, we should open an academy. And so he opens an academy in Accra called Achimota College, which turns out to be a place of formidable importance in terms of the subsequent history of Ghana. Not only did Nkrumah go there, but virtually a who's who of Ghana went there after it opens. So Nkrumah enters the first, the colonial governor's #2 visits the far western region, stops in at that schoolhouse. The Catholic priest says, I've got this kid. The priest didn't know Achimota College was about to be over. Priest says to the colonial official, there's this one guy here, you need to pay attention, somebody has to do something. And so the vice governor invites Nkrumah into the first class of Achimota College. Extraordinary coincidence. Nkrumah gets to Achimota College at a time when a Black man is named as what we would call in America a kind of academic dean and professor. This Black man had been to school in the United States, including the Columbia University. And simultaneously, right at that time, a Gold Coast, meaning African newspaper publisher, hired an editor who was a native Nigerian to edit his newspaper in Accra. And the newspaper, under this new editor, takes on a very articulate sort of stance against colonial rule. It eventually gets shut down. He eventually gets deported from the country, but Nkrumah is illuminated by all of this. Guess what? That guy turns out to be the first president of Nigeria. So this is just unbelievable, right? Already, and we haven't even gotten to the names you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So Kwame Nkrumah hasn't left Accra yet, hasn't left Gold Coast yet, and he's fallen under the influence of these two figures. The Nigerian guy's name is Nnamdi Azikiwe. He had also been to school in the United States, to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, the oldest historically Black university in the United States to offer graduate degrees. And he says, so Nkrumah's excelling at Achimota College, and Kwegyir Agre, the academic dean, and Azikiwe, the newspaper editor, both of whom have been to the States, are in Nkrumah's ear and saying, don't go to the UK. You know, a handful of people would go to the UK from Gold Coast every year to get higher education. And that was it for the entire colony, right? Don't go to the UK, go to the US. Okay? Next big stroke, right? So, and they write letters of introduction, and in the case of Azikiwe, as a alum of Lincoln, this turns out to be very powerful, right? So Nkrumah makes his way in 1935 to Lincoln University, stops in Harlem on his way there. There's a Dutch guy he makes friends with on the seas, on the ocean voyage across the Atlantic. Actually, this person can go on to become famous in any way, but turns out to have been very influential. The Dutch guy was interested in African-American culture. Nkrumah was not interested in African-American culture. Nkrumah was just going off for an education. This shows you the risk of teleology, thinking that Nkrumah or anybody was bound or destined to become something, in the future. Wasn't bound to become Nkrumah we know at all. The Dutch guy, they land in New York. Nkrumah and the Dutch guy have become fast friends, and the Dutch guy says, let's go to Harlem. Nkrumah's not thinking about going to Harlem. The Dutch guy said, okay, whatever, let's go to Harlem. This is 1935. Harlem in 1935 is a jumping place. And it's jumping in very particular ways, right? It's jumping in the sense of just effervescence in terms of African diasporic thought. Every street corner on the main avenues of Harlem has something going on. Public speakers, rallies, organizations of this or that kind. Nkrumah's never seen anything like this. I like to say this is actually, and this is complicated, I hope this doesn't offend anyone, this is where Nkrumah discovers Blackness. Nkrumah wasn't Black in Africa. Yes, he was Black in Africa, but Blackness wasn't a thing for Nkrumah until he got to Harlem. Being Black in Accra, 1935, was like being a fish in an aquarium. You're just in the water. In Harlem, Black takes on a totally different valence. It's like, wow, there's a politics of Blackness that he can see for the first time, and it has multiple currents, and it's got all of this energy and tension internal to it. he had never seen anything like this before. And the funniest piece of the story, I'm giving you from the beginning to the end kind of answer of the coincidences here. So
That's fine. You still have to read the book. It doesn't get you off the hook.
it risks being very long. So maybe I'll stop after this and one other or two other examples. But the funny little anecdote, the Dutch guy says, black churches in Harlem are supposed to be fantastic. Let's go to a black church. And so the Dutch guy he knew a lot, right? Let's go to the Abyssinian Baptist Church, right? Famous, you don't know, like one of the most famous black churches in the world, right? So interesting name, by the way, Abyssinian Baptist Church, right? That has an African residence to it, Ethiopian residence to it. So Nkrumah's just saying yes to whatever the Dutch guy says initially, and they go to church service on Sunday. Nkrumah had he thought he was going to become a Jesuit priest until very recently at that point. And he shows up in a Black American Baptist congregation in Harlem, and it's like nothing he's ever seen before. The Jesuits and the Black Baptists don't worship the same way. And Nkrumah's kind of shocked, even embarrassed. He's like, "Hey, let's get out of here. I don't want you to see this. This is not right. There's something not right here." And the Dutch guy's like, "Oh, no, just cool down. This is all right. This is authentic, right?" This turns out to be really important for him. It plants seeds that are going to take time to mature and to grow. He goes off to spends a week. He shows up in Lincoln late by a week because he lingered in Harlem that way. But he's already energized around these ideas. And at Lincoln, he shows up, interestingly, like none of this could happen today. He didn't have tuition money. They let him go anyway on the basis of a promise that he would find a way to pay along, as he goes. And to pay as he goes, he began doing a whole bunch of things. He began writing papers for other students. He began, he was a gifted student himself. And so he would write papers for money, which I guess you could maybe get expelled for, but he managed to thrive that way. And then he begins to preach. Like he becomes a guest preacher in African-American congregations throughout the mid-Atlantic, and they pay you for those appearances. So he's preaching in Methodist churches and in Baptist churches in Delaware and Pennsylvania and the like, right? And all of this is super important to the development of his communication skills, the ability to read a room, the ability to actually actively listen and to sort of measure the needs of an audience, right? And now coming to your exact question, along the way, he begins to visit Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. in the late 1930s had this very particular institution called Howard University. Nkrumah was at Lincoln, of course, but Howard University, it turns out, he discovers, is this absolute citadel of African-American intellectual talent and energy in this moment. It's just, when you read the histories of, I get into it a bit, but there are entire books about this, right? The quality of the faculty and the range of the faculty at Howard University this time is astounding. And you mentioned some of the names. C.L.R. James is another name that you didn't mention. Eric Williams, who becomes the Prime Minister of independent Trinidad and Tobago, was there. Et cetera, right? And so this is kind of the beginning of the opening of the world to Kwame Nkrumah, and it leads to introductions to W.B. Du Bois and to George Padmore and to a whole suite of other people, and it continues all the way to his presidency. Kwame Nkrumah is, I didn't actually know this before I researched the book either. And this is really jumping ahead, he's the first guest to the White House of John F. Kennedy. Can you imagine? Like, can you imagine that today? Like, any president, we don't have to think about the present president, but any president today in the United States, in your lifetime, well, maybe some of you were alive when Kennedy was, I was. But a recent president having their first guest to the White House, and Kennedy, John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy were so impressed by him and taken with him. And I think and the president so seized by the possibilities of the relationship that he could already begin to imagine, that they took him into the living quarters of the White House. They took him upstairs to see, you know, it's just an amazing study. Like every step is like this.
Then there's a point in your book where you say that, you're taking off from this, for the space of 3 years at the end of the 1950s, Ghana was not only the jewel in the eye of an impressive number of Black Americans, it was easily the most talked about and indeed the most influential country in the third world, with the possible exception of the vastly larger India. So why was that so?
Well, so in part for the reasons I just mentioned, because the example of Gold Coast and Ghana subsequently and Nkrumah in person turned out to be so important in terms of the emergence and direction of the American civil rights movement. So that's one reason. The coverage of Nkrumah, even prior to independence in the African American press in the late 1950s, was something I discovered in the research, was astounding. Like daily coverage of Ghana in the African American press. You have to understand, unlike now, every major American city with a large or sizable African American population had a Black newspaper. And some of the Black newspapers of this time were very important newspapers, you know, verging on national circulation, right? And these places were covering the Gold Coast and then Ghana on a practically day-by-day basis. And so African Americans who were newspaper readers were plugged into the events of Ghana and of Africa by the experience of Nkrumah in ways that are like hard to imagine. There's nothing like that today, right? So that's one reason. Another reason is because the example of Ghana and of achieving independence first among all of the sub-Saharan African European colonies, and then of Nkrumah using the Ghanaian state, actively using the Ghanaian state to assist liberation movements around the continent. So first there's the mere example, the sheer example. So, wow, you're in Zambia, or you're in Malawi, or you're in Tanzania, or you're in
We're all still colonies.
we're all still, everyone's a colony in sub-Saharan Africa. You see, this is possible. This guy did this, and he did it without a war. You know, he used the colonizers' tools against him, and managed to win independence. So this is immensely influential on its own terms. And then beyond that, once he became head of state, he uses the apparatus of the state to actively support. Ghana had a continent-wide radio system. There was Radio Ghana in the late 1950s, broadcasting in African languages around the continent to say, don't accept colonial rule. We are not bound to submit to this any longer. Seek independence now. This is your birthright. This is just an amazing thing, right? Like, there's nothing like it actually presently, but there have been a couple of instances of a state that you wouldn't necessarily have associated. And I don't think this was terribly progressive, if I'm being polite. But in the 90s, I think Gabon, which was a kind of reactionary, very isolated oil state in Central Africa, they had a continental-wide radio network called Africa #1. But Nkrumah was doing this in the 50s, right? And so you have the example on America, and then there's two things in terms of Africa. He was also big in terms of international affairs. He didn't go to the Bandung summit, but he was deeply in touch with the leaders of the Bandung era. And I'll also leave you one final civil rights era anecdote, which is recounted in the book. You know, when the Freedom Riders began to circulate in the American South in the early 1960s, one of the protest tactics was to go sit at luncheon counters in segregated cities and just to wait to be arrested. And very often the arrests turn violent, like the police come in and they would beat the freedom riders with billy clubs as they sat at the counters. And the ideal, I think the common, in fact, response, these people, these freedom riders, were disciplined. They had training sessions around this. Don't try to defend yourself. If they beat you with a billy club, just sit there, right? How many of us have that in us, right? James Baldwin went to cover one of these incidents. I think it was in Winston, Salem, and he wrote an essay that appeared in the New Yorker at the time, in which he asked the freedom riders, how do you muster the courage and discipline to be able to just sit there in the face of this kind of assault? And they say to him, it's the example of Ghana, of Kwame Nkrumah, that we have seen what peaceful resistance can achieve, right? And we want to emulate and to live up to that example. And so the radiation of these ideas is taking place on several different planes, and is basically lost to common popular memory today.
Let's go back to the Kennedy White House for a second, because you talked about how warmly welcomed he was by President Kennedy and his wife. That cooled pretty quickly, because weren't the even still while Kennedy was president, wasn't the US government in touch with people who were thinking about a coup against Nkrumah in Ghana? Why did that happen? What's that about?
So I don't think it cooled quickly. It cooled, for sure. It didn't cool quickly. And this is the way, the mechanics of the breakdown of Ghana's relationship with the United States in this period are complicated, and I tell them at length in the book. But you know, nothing in me inclines me or inclined me prior to working on this book of thinking along Camelot kind of idealistic notions of, you know, new frontier, or, you know, some right moment that the United States had under, but you know, Kennedy was Kennedy, you know, he was an American president, and there's a whole mixture of things you can say about that, and we don't need to be romantic in any sense about this, right? But I do think, in light of the work I did on this book, that Kennedy did have a strong current of what you might call genuine idealism about Africa in him at this time. And he understood that Kwame Nkrumah was the preeminent African leader from the end of the 1950s through the very early 1960s. And therefore, it made sense to try to work through Kennedy, not totally in idealistic ways, but to achieve America's aims. What were America's aims? America's aims were to maximize American influence in the world and to minimize Soviet influence in the world, right? And Nkrumah and Kennedy found some commonalities in each other. They were both, you know, charismatic people and highly intelligent and, you know, supremely self-confident, each of them, right? And they recognized each other in those ways, right? And I think Kennedy actually doesn't sour quickly on Nkrumah for all of those reasons. And so what is Nkrumah seeking? I told you what Kennedy was seeking. Nkrumah was seeking financial backing in the form of loan guarantees, which is not gift giving, loan guarantees for Ghana to be able to create what would become the world's largest artificial lake for the purpose of hydropower generation, so that Ghana could bring online its immense reserves of bauxite to become an industrial power, to become based on aluminum, right? This is Nkrumah's fixed dream early in his time in power. And he's trying to use this relationship with Kennedy to appeal to Kennedy on two bases. One of them is, I need this to give proof of concept, not just for the benefit of Ghana, but proof of concept for that the African continent can industrialize, which it needed to do and still has not done. And you, Kennedy, you need to help me do this because you have this war with the Soviet Union for influence in the world. And if you become the first mover in this constructive way, it will redound really well to the United States. So I think that's the basis of their conversation. Of course, they're both charming each other and being much more articulate than I have just been around these ideas. But I think Kennedy was a very willing participant in promoting this dream of Nkrumah's. However, every time now we're talking 1960, 61, 62, every time the reality of negotiations around what form the loan guarantee would take and the parameters of the dam construction, every time it came close to being finalized, Kennedy's advisors, not charming people, not people who had charisma, not people who enjoyed small talk or even, long dinners with foreign leaders who told good stories, right? They would say, John, don't do it. Pull back, we have to demand more from this. We have to find better ways to guarantee. What were they seeking to guarantee? They were telling Kennedy that no sooner than he signs this thing than we, bring money on the loans on tap, he will then turn around and he'll pocket that and go get in bed with the Soviets. Now, there's a couple of ironies. There are many ironies, but a couple of ironies. One of them is, this is almost certainly pure paranoia at this point. The Soviet Union had brought almost no financial wherewithal to bear on Africa at all in 1961, 62, right? And so the notion that the Soviets, if we, the Americans, sign on and begin give loan guarantees, the Soviets are going to, then do something to counter us, and Nkrumah will get in bed with them. It's basically a paranoid fantasy. There was no reason to believe that was true, right? Anyway, the advisors succeeded in repeatedly getting Kennedy to pull back from the brink and to delay it and to make the contract more advantageous to Western companies, including Alcan, which still exists, a company that makes cans that we drink soda in, for example, very often. If you look at cans that come from a company called Alcan, right? So in the meantime, I'm sorry, I've lost a little bit of track of the exact point that you might have been sticking in. In the meantime, very important things are happening in the global economy. Ghana is deeply dependent and still is deeply dependent on cocoa revenue, right? From 1957, the point of independence, until 1960 thereabouts, world cocoa prices were very high. In early 1961, world cocoa prices begin to collapse. This is the predicament of being a commodity dependent country. Commodities are subject to speculative rise as it falls, and you can't. If you're a commodity dependent country, there's not a damn thing you can do about that. You're at the mercy of international markets, and so Nkrumah is flying high in the late 1960s. Commodity prices are going up, rocketing, right? And then all of a sudden, commodity prices collapsed in 1960, and he still is being strung along by the Kennedy administration. And this becomes a point increasingly of wrongness between the two sides. And
This is about 1962.
yes, yeah. And then, of course, Kennedy gets killed, Johnson takes over, and Johnson has no, for a whole lot of reasons, but Johnson has no notions of engaging in personal diplomacy with Kwame Nkrumah. He's got other fish to fry, notably in Southeast Asia. But and so that becomes the dam gets built under much less favorable terms than it had looked like it might have originally. But by that point, Nkrumah's authority has been undermined by the collapse of the cocoa market. His domestic opposition is vastly emboldened, and he gives into the temptation increasingly of centralizing authority in his own person and ruling by the end quite autocratically.
We are familiar with that pattern.
Yes, we are.
I want to change gears here for a second because I'm under orders to fairly soon give you all a chance to ask questions, but I want to get in one or two of my own. One of which I think, actually both of which sort of have to do with the writing of this book, and which I think will be of interest to students here. How did you research? I mean, obviously you've lived in Africa a lot, you spent time in Ghana, but I noticed you went to Nkrumah's archives to Lincoln. You found an archive in Ghana, which nobody else seemed to be making much use of. Tell us about that and the other sort of archival sources.
So, I'm a journalist by training. I have not ever worked as an academic historian. It's not my thing. And I wrote a book, a few books before this book, about China, which is an exploration of China's own conception of itself as a global power. And of course, because we're talking about China, that runs over a very long period of time. And I knew I wanted to do that, but I was inhabited by a kind of terror, right? I'm not a historian, at least in the formal sense. I'm going to go try to make some interesting statement about Chinese history, like I can just see the firing squads range, all along the parapet. I'm sitting here and bullets are just going to start flying, right? And so this was the beginning of my answer to your question. I just began to inhabit archives and say, there's no way I'm going to just write something based on my own secondary sense of things or experience or whatever, right? I need to really understand the archive, right? And I really feel blessed for having made that, obliged myself to do that, because it's opened up whole new realms of pursuit for me. This book wouldn't have happened otherwise, nor would Global Blackness have happened. In fact, in researching that book, this book about China, I encountered, because I'm covering every era of Chinese history, I encountered accounts by Portuguese explorers in the Indian Ocean and Pacific in the 1500s, which told me for the first time I ever knew this, that the big story that we have of the age of exploration was untrue. That the age of exploration was all about Europeans, Iberians, trying to reach the East for the riches in textiles and spices and whatnot, right? That's just not true. And I learned that it wasn't true because I came across contemporaneous accounts by the Portuguese explorers themselves who spent a half a century dwelling in Africa with no thought of trying to get to Asia. Africa was so important to them that they called, in the case of the Portuguese, they called Africa, the entire continent, the New World. That was the term in the 1500s the Portuguese used for Africa. So we're all taught, Africa's just been excised from the history of the world. It was all about figuring out a way to get around Africa so you could get to Asia and you make all these connections. Nothing against Asia. I finished writing the Chinese book, right? But I bookmarked that in my brain. I said, the archive delivered a gift to me. I have to pursue this, right? And so that becomes Global Blackness, right? And I did the same. So by the time of this book, it's a routine. So I just, I have the benefit of working at a great university, and so there's like any big university, you have not just the physical library that you have present, but you have access via electronic stuff to things everywhere. And I just, that's my first layer in, and then I said, okay, so I'm going to go to various places in Africa and dig. And so that's what I did.
Final question for me, and then you all get a turn. What's your writing process? when you've got the idea for the book, you've done the research or most of the research, you sit down and say, now I gotta get it on paper, what happens then?
So one thing, the research never ends. Like, I can't start writing a book until I feel like I have a firm foundation, but I'm always haunted by, I'm gonna leave something out, or there's gotta be, it's the worst version of this nightmare is, there's something obvious that you overlooked, and it's sitting in some bookshelf somewhere. And as soon as you close this project, 25 people are gonna tell you, hey, you didn't know about this, stupid, right? And so you don't stop researching. I don't stop researching, and you can never really overcome this nightmare altogether, because there's always the possibility that, the ability to keep discovering things for us as humans is almost endless, right? So anyway, I reach a point where I feel like I have my legs underneath me and I can, get the book underway. The first thing I do, I don't know how you handle this, but I'd be interested, but I write the introduction to the book. The introduction to the book is kind of a promise to myself. Okay, here's what I'm going to try to do. Right. And then, I may change the introduction substantially even later, but I need that to feel like I have a course set for myself, right? And then the way I write books, each chapter involves its own discrete research, like there are either particular geographies to them or particular chronologies to them. And so I wouldn't start, by the time I start the book formally, I have a good sense of each of those geographies and chronologies, but I by no means finished the research in time. So as I I start out on a new piece of the book, then I relaunch my research into that specificity and just try to look for newer, richer, less well-known material.
All right, I think we're ready for questions from the board. Now, did you want to take a microphone around, or?
We can, yeah, just because folks will be facing away from the audience, maybe.
Where?
Guess you don't really need the mic. Here.
Yes.
Answer about the organization called ECHO.
What do you think about the organization said?
I'm not gonna move behind you, get your.
Yes, the organization called ECOWAS. What do you think about the organization?
So ECOWAS, thank you, is the Economic Organization of West African States. And Adam asked me earlier about European integration. And I thought about giving this bit of information then, but I already answered it, been too long away. Strangely speaking, although Nkrumah never lived to see even a shadow of the kind of Pan-Africanism that he envisioned become a reality, Africa was ahead of the European Union in some ways in terms of building up a tissue of cooperation at a sub-regional level. And so ECOWAS, Economic Organization of West African States, and various counterparts in other regions of the continent got off the ground in a handsome and promising way in the 1960s, right? Have never lived up fully to their potential, I would say. But Africans didn't simply wait to see the European Union, emerge to say, oh, that's a good idea, we should do that. Africans very actively in their early 60s were already building especially at the sub-region. I think the African Union has been pretty useless. That's the continental body. That's a little harsh, but at the sub-regional level or the regional level, I think Africans have been creative at building a kind of institutional tissue, a cooperative tissue, right? And so ECOWAS, the specific group you asked about is, I wish this had happened 20 years ago, but they seem to be on the verge of getting the bulk of the interstate highway system built. They are working on quite seriously, I think, on a common currency. The big obstacle is Nigeria, because Nigeria is so much bigger than the other countries, and it's also a petroleum state, and so it's hard to harmonize the economies from a macroeconomic perspective of Nigeria with states that are not based on oil and are much smaller. But these are very serious discussions. There are tax-free regimes for intra-regional trade that exist in ECOWAS. There are visa-free travel schemes that exist within ECOWAS that are real and are effective. And so ECOWAS, although I wish it had moved faster and had been even more ambitious, I think ECOWAS provides a lot of positive examples to the continent.
I agree with you. It seems like there's a lot of opposition to ECOWAS by European nations, some of the nations in Africa. Don't you agree?
Well, we live in the real world, and you know, people, interest groups exist all along a broad spectrum, and anyone whose interests are threatened by anything are going to throw, you know, opposition to it, right? And so, but I'll just say one more thing. So, one of the things that doomed in his lifetime Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-African project is the fact that of his own success. So if Ghana becomes independent because of Nkrumah in 1957, in 1958, Guinea becomes independent, in 1960, 17 African countries become independent. They're all following Gold Coast, Ghana's example, right? Something strange happens along the way, right? It's not so strange when you think about human nature. You know, it's nice to be a president. It's nice to be in a state house. It's nice to have a diplomatic staff at your beck and call. It's nice to have, if this is the type of person you are, not nice for your country, but to be able to dip into the treasury or the minister of finance. You know, it's nice to be received overseas as a dignitary and to go on junkets, right? And so
I've never known anything like that.
and so as soon as all these states are born, interests become encrusted around small localized elites that become very hard to overcome, right? And this becomes the biggest obstacle, I think, in Nkrumah's lifetime to building a bigger, broader union that functions. And what I hear today.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My question is about Kwame Nkrumah's thinking around military cooperation among African countries in resistance to colonialism. How did his thinking around military cooperation evolve as you researched and wrote this book?
So thank you. While he was in power, Kwame Nkrumah's main emphasis was on nonviolent pacifist activism. He organized some important conferences in the late 1950s where he invited independence movements from embryonic, for the most part, independence movements. This is how Lumumba gets actually activated and induced into politics. He comes to Ghana and he sees Lumumba had been a very moderate person, like almost conservative up until that point. He comes to Ghana in 1958 and he hears the independentist rhetoric at a conference that Nkrumah puts on, All African People's Congress in Accra. He hears, for example, Frantz Fanon give a speech at this conference saying violence is the only solution, right? That the colonizer's never going to concede anything important unless you force him to, right? But Nkrumah does not really become a backer of military means in other colonies, except with the one exception that I know of Guinea-Bissau, very late in his presidency. Nkrumah begins to give training, the Ghanaian army gives some training to the movement that would eventually achieve independence in Guinea-Bissau. And then in 1966, Nkrumah is overthrown and he moves to Guinea under Sékou Touré. And from that point, his thinking changes quite radically. He becomes more, I would say, faminousist about the use of military force, right? And says to Africans via Guinea's radio station and contacts that he sustained with liberation movements in various parts of the continent. Look, if the colonizer, the Portuguese were the big holdouts at the time. If the colonizer resists the idea of independence, we have no other choice but to bear arms, to pick up arms and to fight for our independence, right? So you have to look at his life vis-a-vis this question in phases.
Hi. Sorry. So as some parents are from parents are from Sudan, South Sudan. One of the things that I struggle with is the fact that in a certain way colonialism also led to some of these Pan-African movements, right? Is that the way that organized smart people and people from different ethnic groups and different regions and which really kind of crescendoed around the Second World War. So I don't know, how do you think we can approach, that legacy without becoming revisionists that are pro-colonialism? And then also, how would you move forward today? Like what would be avenues for these type of kind of collaborative movements amongst African people African diaspora today? And then just one last point, because I'm from Sudan. Sudan is actually the first African country that was independent. I'm sorry.
I didn't say first African country.
You said sub-Saharan, I know, but it's a bit.
So Sudan, we could spend a long time on
Yeah,
this.
we can.
Sudan,
I'll go.
Sudan was not a European colony in the classic sense. It
Yeah, it's
was a European Egyptian colony.
Yeah, Anglo-Egyptian, yeah,
Right.
because we drew the British out, so.
And so it doesn't really fit it requires a big asterisk, but I think you understand the.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I do think many Sudanese people feel a bit frustrated that there isn't a lot of recognition about that 1956, independence, and anyway.
So the microphone broke up a little bit when you said something about the colonizer, but I think I got the gist of your questions. I'll try my best. I'm an admirer of Kwame Nkrumah, but I'm not an idealizer of Kwame Nkrumah. I don't think Kwame Nkrumah had every answer, or he's a perfect person, or anything like that. And I can't find anyone who is in a political leadership role who has been a perfect person and who has every answer, right? But I do think Kwame Nkrumah understood this. Kwame Nkrumah understood that in a world of intense and enduring hostility to people of African descent, that the best recourse of people of African descent everywhere was to build bridges among themselves. And that meant not just breaking down the artificial walls that the Berlin Conference had created in configuring colonies in the 1880s, and building a Pan-Africanism, but by building a global movement. And I think that was intensely sage on the part of Kwame Nkrumah, that if Africa had a powerful lobby in the United States, a constituency of African Americans who insisted that in the normal course of things, the United States needs to have a positive, progressive, and engaged policy toward Africa. I think the policy toward Africa would be different. But that doesn't exist. I talk about the high tide in this book of Global Blackness because the tide receded. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was possible to think of a Black world that was integrated in terms of these energies much more than it is today, right? And I think that the way forward for Africa, and by extension, the way forward for people of African descent, is to reconstitute some of these constituencies and connections, and that without them, a continent composed of 54 or whatever the number is countries, most of which are small, weak, poor,
and often landlocked, is a recipe for disaster for Africans. And because it's a disaster for Africans, I also think African Americans and other people in the African diaspora are losing something. Right? So that's where I think the most important nugget of wisdom from Kwame Nkrumah comes from.
I wanted to go back to Adam's first question, and it might, excuse me, pick up on the statement you just made. I'm wondering if you have any reflections. So the question is, why isn't there more serious journalism about Africa and sustained journalism? And I guess that as I thought about this issue, one of the problems is the market, right? There's a question of supply, who is going to write? But there's often the problem of the demand. Who is going to demand consistent, engaged, thoughtful, sustained analysis for the public? And I'm just, you're someone over the course of your career who's been able to make those interventions. And I think the question is, what arguments have been successful? How do you build a market where people are demanding serious analysis and work for the public on Africa that's not episodic, etc.? So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that for the course of your career. Thank you.
Sure, and this is the question that's bedeviled me for my entire life, and I don't have a ready answer really, but I'm going to try to offer a couple of thoughts. One of them is, it goes back to my previous comments. African Americans have been actively trained to not be interested in Africa. It is not an accident. It is a process of American acculturation that has had strategy and business behind it, right? This is a real thing. It is threatening, almost, you might say, to just to speak in bland generalism, right? To the system, to have African Americans thinking about themselves the way that Jewish Americans might, or Italian Americans might, or you name it, Americans might, right? There's been a very long and persistent history of discouraging, I'm doing another book I'm not going to get into now, but look, it's mostly set in the 1930s and 40s. African Americans were actively encouraged to turn their back. It's a miracle that Nkrumah created this high tide, because the force, the impulses were downward from the government, the state, capitalism, all the rest were pushing. The winds were blowing so strongly in another direction, right? It starts in school. It's reinforced by Hollywood. I'm sorry, this is a topic for a whole other talk. But the power of whiteness in our culture is an extraordinary. You don't have to be black to know this, right? The power of whiteness in our culture is just an overwhelming thing, right? And it has a cohesion and a force behind it, right? It's everywhere, right? And African Americans can't escape that, have not been able to escape that. So that's one thing. That's one level of the answer. The other level of the answer is, I'm actually somewhat pessimistic about the near term with regards to your question, but I'm not pessimistic about the long term. And here's why. Believe it or not, by the end of this century, it's all, for projections purposes, this is hard. This is, the margin of error is large, right? But Nigeria is probably going to be one of the 10 largest economies in the world. Africa, by the end of this century, will have more people than India and China combined. Okay, so where's the interest in Africa going to come from? We are in a society, in a world today, where there's active disinterest in Africa. Everything is arrayed against being interested in Africa. Howard French is a kook. Why is he writing this stuff about Africa? How did he get stuck on Africa? Isn't there some other parts of the world you could write about, right? I mean, this is a real thing, greed is going to become the thing that reawakens the world to Africa. I just hope Africans are ready for it. I hope African Americans are ready for it, right? Most of the marginal growth in the world population between now and the end of the century is going to come from Africa. What does that mean? That means most of the working age people in the world are going to be in Africa. What does that mean? That means most of the brains in the world, the new brains, the new young brains in the, we are trained not to think about Africa in terms of brains. Guess what? We are going to realize those brains are actually really important to productive purposes in the world that we depend on. We need African brains to do stuff. We are not just going to need Africans to clean bedpans and to be orderlies and to be nurses in our hospitals and taxi drivers. We're going to need African brains, right? We are going to need African consumers. It will serve no one any purpose in the scheme of things if in 2050 or 2075, global consumption from a capitalist perspective is depressed because Europe is shrinking and China is shrinking and Japan is shrinking and South Korea is shrinking and the United States and Canada are shrinking population wise, aging, old people don't spend money. Who's going to spend the money? Well, it's going to be young Africans or it's going to be nobody. And so somebody is going to figure this out at some point. And guess what? We've been sleeping on Africa for the last 500 years. We better wake up. Africa is really, really important. I believe that very deeply. I don't know how much of it I'll see, but I think that's true. He's been very patient in the front row, if I may take the speaker's prerogative.
Which news sources you follow nowadays to keep current about the different countries? African countries.
I teach journalism, and so one of the things I try to teach my students is you have to be compulsive about informing yourself. So I read pretty much all of the mainstream publications on an obsessively, comprehensive basis, and in different language. So I do that. And you kind of make you begin gathering things and putting them together, piecemeal thing you get from some publication or some African publication or mainstream American publication, or sometimes surprisingly the Wall Street Journal will have something interesting, But another important source of information for me has been, and some of you will cringe, but social media has been very valuable too. And that's because of the way I use social media. I don't use social media. I don't care how, we're free people. I use however you want, whatever gets you off, right? Go for it. But I use social media for information purposes. I follow people who I know to be reliably interesting and who maximize my chances of seeing more things sooner than I would have seen them if I were left to my own devices. That's who I follow. And through social media, I end up seeing tons of stuff that maybe I would never have seen, or that maybe I would have discovered much later, or whatnot. And it becomes a very productive way of, it sounds awful, but harvesting eyeballs. I'm like harvesting other people's eyeballs to see more stuff.
Thank you very much for the presentation.
Sorry.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm wondering, picking up Nkrumah's 1965 book, Neocolonialism,
the highest stage of imperialism. I'm just wondering what you think is living and dead in his sort of mature critique of neocolonialism, and also how he might view China's projection of economic and soft power in the continent today.
Great question. So there's a way of thinking about Nkrumah's career in which you could conclude, and as some people do, not just about Ghana, but of lots of Africa in general, that Africa probably suffered for having become independent so quickly.
What do I mean? Europeans were not preparing Africa for independence, right? African colonies, just to speak in generalities, almost always had less than 10 years of true national politics before they became independent. Imagine that. You live in a place that had no national politics and then you become independent, right? That was the rule in Africa, okay? And it was a rule because Europeans did not want to encourage, in fact, often actively discourage independence and would jail people who dared bring up the topic or especially organize about it, right? And so there's a way of thinking, and some people say these sorts of things, that however brilliant Nkrumah might have proven to be tactically, strategically, this was a disaster. Africa became independent before it was prepared to be independent, and this led to a big wasted couple of decades, and it was a tragedy, blah, 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 right? Believe that. Here's why I don't believe it. I don't believe it precisely because Europeans were not preparing Africa for independence. And so this presupposes a naive conclusion that if Africans had been more patient, Europeans would eventually have prepared them for. Why should you believe that?
No way.
There's nothing to suggest that at all. Colonization was very good for Europeans. Ghana in 1947 was the second largest earner of foreign exchange for Britain in the world, after Malaysia, in the world. Why would Britain have been in it? And Britain was in bad shape in 1947. It needed foreign currency. Why would the Europeans have been in a hurry to decolonize Africa, right? So that's the first piece of the answer. The second piece of the answer, I do not believe that if decolonization had happened in the dreamscape of the British or in, you name it, whatever other colonizer, Africa would have been better off. So in the dream vision of the British, there was a coterie, and I talk about them a lot in the book, of Oxford-trained lawyers who actually recruited Nkrumah back to Ghana to help them form a political party. The British thought that these guys would form the party that would win, that would eventually become the Independence Party. And that was their slogan. We'll become independent when the time comes. That I'm paraphrasing, but that was their initial slogan. You know, I don't believe that had collaborationist forces become the main motors of independence in Africa, Africa would have been better off today. And the reason I don't believe that is because neocolonialism is not good for Africa. Neocolonialism presupposes just going along with the system of hierarchy in the global economy, which totally cuts Africa out of value added, of local processing, of manufacturing, and says you need to keep your capital markets open to us, where while we keep our markets for commodities, we subject them to taxes. Why would that be good for Africa? So this is what Nkrumah saw in that book and in other writings, that neocolonialism was an evil that Africa needed to overcome. Nkrumah didn't understand necessarily how to overcome it, but he was right in the diagnosis. Neocolonialism is there's nothing good about neocolonialism, right? What Africa still needs to figure out is how to get it on its own feet, on its own terms, in ways that really address the needs of Africans, as opposed to extroverting all of their thinking and policies to outside shops, whether it's the IMF or it's the Foreign Office or it's the State Department or it's the World Bank or whatnot.
Well, that was an incredibly powerful point, Howard, but I'm afraid we have to end. Right? It's a good point to end on. And I want to thank you all for coming. Thank Howard for being here. Urge you all to read the book and to also have a look at some of his other books. Born in Blackness will make you think about history in a very different way. China's Second Continent, nobody has done that job on an equivalent job on looking at what the new colonialists from China are in Africa. So
Let me just say, I'm sorry, on China, I think Nkrumah would be, I think the balance on balance, China has been better for Africa than an alternative history, which would not have China engaged with Africa. However, it's complicated. Everything's not been good about China and Africa. I think Nkrumah would have been wary about as with any power imbalance, what are the consequences for us? What kind of agency is left for us? How much of this amounts to being an imposition upon us and upon our own sovereignty and ability to be in charge of our choices and things like that? I think he would have been wary of those things.
So, thank you again, and thank you all for coming.